Welcome to the Bad Boss Brief. I am Stephanie Peirolo.
And I'm Eugene S. Robinson.
And today, episode 46 is the losing show. We are talking about losing at work.
You know, I wanted to do I had a fictional movie I wanted to do. I wanted to call it The Losers. And the tagline was going to be, they had one last chance and they blew it again and again and again and again. And yeah, this ties in very nicely to the season for some of us.
For some of us, yeah. And, you know, I was intentional in thinking about do we call it the loser show or the losing show? And the reason I went with losing, which isn't as mellifluous, is because I want to make a distinction at work between losing and being a loser.
Correct.
Because I think if we can reclaim our attitudes and narratives around losing, we can actually lose less. And one of the narratives is that if you lose, you are a loser. I would invite us all to reframe that and listen to how you can make losing into a learning experience.
We could lose losers.
Exactly. So what I wanted to, we all have opportunities to lose at work, right? And the reason that this is interesting, one of the reasons this is interesting to me is because for many, many years, I did a new business role in advertising agencies, which is basically doing a big pitch, like theater level foolishness to try to win a big account, right? So let's say that, you know, Lexus decides that they want a new advertising agency. There's this whole big involved thing that's called a pitch where they have agencies pitch against one another. And in the day, they would make us give away our work for free.
Yeah.
A lot of work for free. We do, here's free creative, here's what your media plan should be, here's your interactive. I mean, there was a bunch of stuff that we gave away for free, which I don't recommend, but I would work, and it was my job to run these pitches and to ultimately close the deals. So, and get us into the pitches. And often I would work for, 3 or 4 months, sometimes working overnight, 7 days a week. We'd spend hundreds of thousands of dollars and we would lose.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's a dramatic way of losing. And because I ran hundreds of pitches and lost many of them, I had plenty of opportunity to practice losing skillfully. But there's a lot of other ways to lose, right? You try to get a promotion and the promotion for which you are eminently qualified, and it goes to someone else, right? You lose your job. The division in which you work loses a big contract and closes down. There's a lot of ways of losing. And what we want to talk today is kind of how you can approach and reframe that. So before we jump in, do you have any good work loss stories?
Yeah. And I'll keep the names quiet. A friend of mine worked for Universal Records in Hamburg and had a big moment where he signed Rammstein, or I like to say Rammstein, and it was huge for them. An international sensation, really put him up on top. But, you're as good as your last success. Immediately after that, I think he signed, well, I was involved in this slightly. He said, I wanted to sign a band that used to be called Raggedy Ann, a Palo Alto band, and they got huge in America. And I was like, they're lousy, and he didn't sign them, but instead went and signed a band called Biscuit Boy. And they spent about $3 million on a single video for Biscuit Boy. And when the record came out, he said it didn't do that well. He was explaining to me why he was leaving. He signed Biscuit Boy. They spent $2 to $3 million on the music video. And I said, well, why are you leaving Universal? And he said, well, Biscuit Boy didn't do that well after he spent all that money on the video. And I go, well, how badly did he do? He said, well, they only sold 130 records. And I go, 130,000 is not bad. He goes, no, not 130,000, 130 records. And clearly this was enough that when they looked around for people to hold responsible for this, he's the one who advised that they sign, even though he had a massive win with Rammstein. When it came to Biscuit Boy, it absolutely ruined him, and he left music to never return. I think he ended up moving out of the country to Canada and Montreal and going into high tech. I mean, that was, here today, gone tomorrow. It was a massive case of loss, massive. My heart went out to the guy. However, I had a guy who was at Disney, almost crashed Disney with a movie called Treasure Planet, and which was a take on Treasure Island. And he's got 3 movies coming out in 2025, so he bounced back quite nicely. So loss is not an automatic indicator of failure, and that's, I think, I try to remind myself of that all the time.
Well, and he made a bet. He made a bet on an artistic, he made a play on an artist, and he lost the bet. And that's going to happen, right? Artists make bets on particular works or pieces, and they aren't successful. They're flops. So what do you do if you have a loss? Well, the first thing is feel the fuck out of your feelings. Right? Yeah. A lot of times we try to rush through an emotional reaction. And I think it's important to take a beat to metabolize whatever comes up for you, right? So for some person, it might be rage, it might be disappointment, it might be, questioning your self-esteem. Like there's all sorts of reactions that we can have. And I don't think it serves us to pretend those aren't existing, right? So feel your feelings. I advise people who have a loss in a work situation to try to metabolize it outside of work. Right? Especially if it's an internal loss. If you lose out on a promotion and someone else in your department gets promoted, you are going to want to, if you want to keep that job, you're going to want to keep quiet at work about all the reasons you think that loss was not fair. But when you go home, when you talk to an executive coach, when you're talking to a friend, feel free to fully metabolize whatever frustration you have before you move into anything else.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. When I did Code Magazine in Los Angeles, they had decided they were convinced by this woman who now runs a film festival back in Martha's Vineyard. They were convinced that I was not an August enough of an editorial presence to get people to ignore the fact that Larry Flint was starting a men's fashion magazine. And so they said, we're taking away the editor-in-chief title from you, and we're going to give it to the California Poet Laureate, Quincy Troop. And there was a full expectation that in a fit of pique, I would walk. And I didn't. And I decided to turn that loss into a win, and that I would dig my nails in much more aggressively and through tone and timbre, turn the publication into something that was indispensable without me. And it took me about 3 issues to do that. And at a certain point, I walked into the vice president's office and I said, you know what? You don't need me. You guys don't need me. You got, the poet laureate. What do you need me for? And since on the Peirolo path, he had been running the publication to the ground. This is right before he got busted for lying about what got him the poet laureate position in the first place. So he lost the poet laureate of California position. And then they said, well, do we keep him or Eugene? Eugene's done 3 great issues. Let's give it. And they gave him the boot, and they gave, so that was a little behind the scenes kind of maneuvering that worked out in my favor. But no loss is fully a loss in my mind unless they drag you physically from the building. A lot of stuff can be played to your advantage.
But that is exactly the reason why we metabolize elsewhere, right? If you had run around trying to get this guy fired, talking trash about him, that you just allowed things to unfold and the chips to fall where they will. And look, you were the one who was more competent, and you ended up getting that position that you had originally, quote unquote, lost. So, and then the second thing is, and this is the important thing, which I think people know intuitively, which is what can you learn from the loss? But I think in order to get there, there's two steps, right? So the first one is to understand what narratives you are carrying about this loss, right? So this is more for people. Like I'd like to write. I write to figure things out. So I'm a big journaler. I write articles. So my first thought is to go to writing. So what I would recommend to someone like me is write down all the narratives that you have about this loss. No judgment about whether they're true, fair, mature, anything, right? So if I were up for a promotion and I lost out on that promotion to someone who was 35, one of my narratives might be, this is an ageist organization. Right? I lost out to somebody who is younger than my daughter. That must be an integral part of what happened. right? And that may be true, but by taking the time to write down what are all the narratives that are happening, I give a little distance to myself, right? Like writing it down as a narrative, and why I use this construct of narrative is because it pops us into the observing ego. So we are less enmeshed in the story. So saying one of my narratives is X is different than I got fired or I didn't win this from promotion because of my age. So that's the first thing. And I think take a minute with it, because sometimes we can have narratives that are a little bit more below the surface, right? Like, my boss has always had it out for me. This is, this company is never going to be innovative. And there may be interesting things for you to learn there, right? As you look at these narratives, you may stop and be like, I can't stay here, right? So examine your narratives thoroughly without judgment, and then go back and look at because a lot of times for many of us, including myself, my narratives will be very quick to point out everything that is wrong with everybody else. Right. And I won't initially look at my part in this. The second part of this is to look at what is my part. So to use the example of the older person who loses out on the promotion to somebody who's younger, I might need to get curious about, well, what am I doing? Have I stayed up on technology? Do I have some prejudices against working with people who are in their 30s? And do I say snide things about their generation or talk about how entitled they are? Right. And sometimes we cannot see these things about ourselves. So we may need to get feedback. We may need to talk to our supervisor, talk to a coworker, talk to somebody who's, again, we mention this often, who is the truth teller in your life, and say, can you, putting aside whatever else I think happened, can you think of any reason why I might not have gotten this promotion?
Right.
And I think it's generally a good idea to sort of look at those things for ourselves. What are you thinking?
I was thinking that one, we talk about confirmation bias and how people buckle under performance pressure, born of expectation causes people to buckle under. And I remember one job, probably my second, third job out of college, and it was the easiest editorial job ever. And I was doing it, and I could see that the guy who was my direct report, my boss, I could see that he had doubts about whether I was up to par. And I go, these doubts are ridiculous. At one point, he asked me to explain why this sentence, "I ate a bagel," was incorrect. And I was like, okay, I had eaten a bagel. I got you. And at a certain point, rather than be driven from pillar to post based on an insecurity that I absolutely did not have about my editorial skills, I just shut down. I just completely shut down. And it was a collision course of failure. And that's when I decided at a certain point, you know what, I should let them off the hook. I marched into the guy's office, go, you don't need me. I'm going to leave. I got other stuff to do. And that's right around the time when you and I met again, and I opened up my store. And it was the Electric Power Research Institute that I was at. And they were just very traditional. A person who had been there like 13 years before. They were not ready or willing to change. And it's been a great delight when I've been at magazine contests like Folio's Magazine Awards, and I've walked by somebody who I knew from that period, on the stage to get an award. It's like, hey, how you doing? It wasn't that I couldn't do well. I just chose not to do well. And, embracing loss in that weird way was actually I found to be great for my mental health. Much better than the other path, which is to think, oh my God, I'm terrible, which I never believed about myself for a second. I could have been wrong, but in the fullness of time, it seemed like that was not the case. So,
well, and you bring up a couple of important points there. One being that, there are some people who look outward and blame everybody else for their loss. There are others that take on too much responsibility. Right. So, people, and this is, I often see this more with women than with men, because there is this sense of we have to, be, overfunction for people and make sure that everybody's emotionally comfortable if that's indeed how we are socialized. But understanding that that is a narrative too. It's all my fault. I'm the worst person in the world. And chances are that's an overreaction, right?
Yeah.
If a division folds, if a company founders, chances are it's not your fault unless you were the actual founder of the company.
Right.
Right. I mean, you know, and a lot of people will over index on blaming themselves. And the challenge is that's not accurate either. Right. And so if you're going into some shame spiral, that is not going to be helpful. And again, it's probably not true. Right.
Right.
You know,
In the blame gaming that goes on afterward, I remember getting a call from somebody at Ozzy Media who was slightly chagrined that I had both written a piece on the collapse of Ozzy and then I'd written a piece for the New York Times. And I said, it was joking, but you know, jokes are hostility masked or something like that. And I think I said, wait a second, you can't honestly believe that me writing about the collapse of Ozzy for the New York Times caused Ozzy to collapse. Is that how we're going to understand the loss of the last 10 years of our hard work? And she kind of paused and goes, no, I'm not saying that. But it was like she had to think about it because she was saying that. But it was nice to, you know, I understand the blame game. I've been reading a lot of it the last week or so, apropos of I don't know what, and I don't find it to be particularly useful, you know.
Well, and often the blame game is wrong.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think what's interesting is that a lot of times there will be these facile narratives that are just an extension of some delusion or illusion that somebody has, right? So for example, you can see how assiduously we are steering away from the obvious political example, which we're doing intentionally. But let's say that I was running a big advertising pitch. And if I was doing that right now and we lost, my guess is that somebody in leadership would say, it's because our AI isn't good enough. We need to double down and hire more experts in AI. That's why. That's what the problem is. Well, that's a facile narrative that may be accurate, but it's so quick and everybody's talking about it that it's like, let's take a beat and get curious. So there's a lot of narratives about why a loss happens in an organization. A lot of them are not based on any kind of data. They're just an extension of prejudice. It's the hot take. Right. And unless you are someone in academia, unless you are, you know, your hot take is probably, if it's not based on data, it's probably not particularly effective. So like one of the things, to use this example, that I would do when we lost a pitch, I would, wherever possible, call the decision maker at the client and convince them that it would be really helpful to me if they could tell me why we lost. Right? And often it was not the narrative that the executive leadership had, right? Like, you know, well, it must be Goodby Silverstein because nobody's ever going to beat Goodby in anything. And why did we even bother? And I might call the client and they might indicate that we didn't lose to Goodby. And the reason we lost was because our, you know, the people on the team clearly hated one another's guts. Right? I mean, like and of course, the leaders, I'm thinking of a particular pitch team who will remain unnamed, but that particular boss would never look at the fact that his dynamic with the other people on the team was so bad that it was really off-putting. I mean, you want to hire an ad agency where you like the people and you can see working in close partnership with them. And if the leader is such a jerk that he's insulting other people on the team, that relationship is going to be problematic. And so I think that's an example of where the powers that be can go for the easy narrative. Oh, it's about X, rather than looking at the hard thing about like, no, it's because I don't treat the people that I work with well. And it's obvious when I'm in a room.
It's great. It's great that you asked. For years, Dirk Dirksen, kind of the godfather of San Francisco punk rock, refused to book Whipping Boy, my hardcore band. And I pinned him to the wall one day and said, why? Why? Is there a reason why you will not? That's not my style at all to ask. And he goes, yeah, I was here one night and I saw your guitar player and he was treating his girlfriend like crap. I was like, what? And so I went back to the guitar player, go, hey, he says that you were treating your girl. Did that? He goes, oh, well, we got into an argument. And I was like, So I had to go back and say, romantic love is tough. Its ways are rough. I mean, I had to make up some kind of fantastical kind of explanation for why he had had a bad night. And the guy relented and gave us a break and started booking us. But it was that not at all my style. But in that one instance, I had like the line from Dirty Harry. I got to know. I had to know. So yeah, it's kind of illuminating, and that's not what I would have expected at all. I was completely blindsided by that answer.
Right. And that often happens. And I learned this early on in my career. It's like I will find out like why, because the assumptions that we make are not like, so to use the example of the older woman who doesn't get a promotion. Right. If she really is careful about trying to get feedback, she may find out that her attitude towards people that are younger than she is perceived as being very dismissive, very, kind of looking down her nose at them. And so people don't want to work with her.
Yep.
Right. And it doesn't mean that ageism isn't a factor. It doesn't mean that sexism isn't a factor. It just means that there is something in her control. Right. Because this is something I say all the time here and to my clients. What is the problem you're trying to solve? Is it a solvable problem? And is it solvable by you? Right. So in a lot of circumstances, I can't solve for ageism. I can't solve for sexism, but I can solve how I show up in ways that are going to indicate I'm not your average granny. Right. I wish I didn't have to do that, but that's the reality. So I think, and I guess the point is that the more information you have, the more skillfully you can assess what your next steps are. Because your next steps, when you look at all this stuff, maybe I can't work here. I've looked at my side of the street. I'm never going to get the promotion. Then, of course, you want to look at what narratives, like, do you have stories around whether or not you're allowed to quit? Right? Quitting, as you have said, as we've talked about before, can be the most empowering decision you can make.
Oh, my God.
Your career, your health. As you know,
I have yet to regret a quit. Well, I regretted moving from Apple to Adobe, but that wasn't really a quit. Right. Yeah.
And so if you lose and you go through whatever your thoughtful examination process is, whether it's this or something else, you may decide, you know what, I don't need to be here. Right. And I agree. When I have done that process, I have never regretted ending a work relationship. The other thing is you can decide if it makes sense to stay. Right. Like, I mean, if I had $1 for every literary agent, publisher, anything that is said to me, go away, you are not like, I would have a lot of money. Right. I've had so many rejection letters and I didn't consider that to be losing. I just figured out, what can I do next? What can I do next? What can I do next? It hasn't brought riches and fame, but I do have a book coming out from a real publisher in the spring. And so if you have that understanding, if you continue to get curious, if you continue to look, it might work out okay. And then the last thing that I want to say, which is, about all of the ways that you might be experiencing loss right now, is that don't underestimate how difficult it is. Right. And don't let anybody push you through that feeling your feelings process until you're ready. And realize that, like, hope is important. It keeps us moving forward, but hope is a blade, right? And if you had a hope and it was dashed to the ground, you're going to feel it, and you may feel it for a while. And it's okay to just sort of be in that dark place, but losing does not mean being a loser. And if you get curious about it, you can reframe it and see what happens in the future.
One of my favorite speeches is the old Italian man's speech to Clevenger in the House of Prostitution in Catch-22. And he said, listen, Germans came here, we saluted them. You, the Americans, came, we salute you. In the end, us Italians will still be here. Which Clevenger didn't really like. He didn't like that attitude. He goes, as the wind blows. What kind of attitude is that? He goes, a perfectly serviceable one. In the end, what is it they say? You can't lose if you don't quit, or some kind of high school coach thing. I've taken that to heart. In many regards. Exactly. Both of us have.
Yeah, so. Here we are, still here. Yeah. So did you have a fire me?
Yeah, we didn't want to get overtly political, but the echoes, the parallels here with the proposed announced possible Secretary of Defense being this guy with a Knights Templar tattoo on his chest, as well as another kind of white nationalist tattoo on his arm. And it just reminded me of when I was at this big magazine and they were not going to the woman who was head of marketing was looking for information online about me to announce that I would be the new editor and chief editorial director. This is at Music Player. So it was for EQ magazine, and then found a documentary film that had been made on us in which I was throttling an unruly audience member. And there were serious discussions about, we can't let this guy work here. And this being the same company that hired the guy who had the swastika tattoo on his forehead. A guy who they hired and kept in the job for years before finally, forces around just started to congeal. We can't have this guy, even though he's a systems guy, he works in the back. No, we can't. With free expression, fine. Look, the guy's got a swastika on his forehead. So it just, that the go-to move is this troll-esque kind of announcement of this guy for Secretary of Defense. I find writ small everything I need to know about how the next 4 years are going to play out. So that's it's a loose fire me. I mean, because I don't have a prescriptive for not how to be that kind of ass. But certainly we've come out of 4 years of not having that kind of assery, to make up a word. So that is the closest I've come to a fire me on today. I recognize the tattoos immediately. So if you're not tuned into this stuff, you're like, he's got a tattoo that says 88 on it. For those not in the know, that's letter H, Heil Hitler. But it's like, oh my God, in plain sight, not even very hard to see. And I was like, this is the world we're living in. But you know what? You can't lose if you don't quit.
Well, and I think also, this is the reason why, this topic appealed to me. It's a way to talk about it without talking about it. Because I think I'm very much in that very, very first stage. I am feeling the fuck out of my feelings. And I am being very intentional about what kind of media I interact with. There's a lot of things I'm not looking at. There's not a lot of I need to just feel my feelings. And I also am mindful of things that do float up in the media that are those hot takes, and recognizing there's very few people that I'm paying attention to, Dr. Tressie Cotton being one of them, because she's talking about, and she is more thoughtful and looking at other data. But aside from Dr. Cotton, I'm not really paying attention to a lot of things. And you know what? At some point I will. At some point there will be action. At some point there'll be other things. But right now I'm going to do a podcast with my old friend, and then I'm going to go out in the other room and play with my grandkids and just try to have a little bit of as much peace as possible at the moment.
Yeah, as I've said to people before, on planet Earth, there are real people living real lives, and we are going to join them.
Yes, exactly. All right. On that note, I would just invite any of you that want to ask us any questions or suggest show topics, or if you want to ask us an advice question for our shorter Sub Rosa podcast, WTF at badbossbrief.com. Again, WTF at badbossbrief.com. I read every single one and respond to anything that isn't trying to sell us something. So we will be back again in a couple of weeks. And until then, take care. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Adios.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Bad Boss Brief podcast with your hosts, Eugene S. Robinson and Stephanie Peirolo. You can check out more of their work by visiting consigliera.substack.com for Stephanie and eugenesrobinson.substack.com for Eugene. You can also find Eugene at Mr. Sleep 3, that's number 3, on Instagram. Reach out with your questions, concerns, worst case situations, or suggestions to us at WTF@badbossbrief.com. We personally answer every submission. Be sure to join us at badbossbrief.substack.com every other Wednesday for episodes of Bad Boss Brief, so you can gain further insights into your workplace environments. Until next time, don't be an asshole at work.